I was so delighted when I was asked to come to Four Corners because I'd grown up with the program. It was a favourite of my mother's. I was really proud just to join the team. And I was a bit of an unusual choice too. I hadn't sort of come through the news and current affairs school so much. And I think there was a benefit there because I didn't know what you couldn't do. And then the first program I did was The Big League. And a lot of people said, well, this is the best program you're ever going to do. You just got lucky the first time. And I said, I don't think so. I said, I sort of felt that I'd discovered a way to make important television.
However violent is the game of rugby league, what happens on the field is there for all to see.
By the time I got about 4 or 5 weeks into the project, it did change direction.
Our investigation into this episode has uncovered important new evidence, which indicates that a serious interference with the administration of justice may have taken place.
It's one of the nice things about investigative reporting. You know, you follow the path wherever it leads. And in this case, a program that began sort of poking around the rugby grounds ended up looking into the magistracy and the role of government. The head of the rugby league ended up going to jail. Charges were brought against the former chief stipendiary magistrate. A royal commission, the premier stood down. A mixed result, I have to say. In the end, the premier was exonerated. That was the first time of many times, as it would turn out, that I found myself having to deal with a really long tail, a program with a really long tail, that just getting it to air was only the first part of the job. The next part was defending it, and so I spent a lot of time with lawyers, and that seemed to be my lot for the next 20 or so years. The next program that I made after The Big League was The Dead Heart.
Locals have a name for this place.
We heard a story about a couple of boys going missing in the outback. We didn't know what had happened to them. In fact, I have to say I never really found out for sure. But that didn't mean that I didn't have a story. I think that when I came to Four Corners, I recognized that there were a lot of different ways to tell stories, that it wasn't just the sort of classic news and current affairs formula. I plotted it in the way you would a movie.
The station vehicle was in poor repair.
I remember going out into the outback with a producer and trying to figure out what had happened, and then handwriting a shooting script.
Fuel filter. But still, it had managed to carry the boys a remarkable distance.
I managed to find an old farm ute that was exactly the same as the ones the boys took into the desert. And we had our props department back in Sydney make up a number plate that was exactly the same. Once I had the vehicle, I had a way to tell the story.
They tried repeatedly to restart the motor.
You always prefer to have the story ahead of the issue because people will follow a story. The issue was youth employment, but the story was about these boys going missing. We ended up camping at the sand dune where the vehicle eventually could proceed no further, and that's where the boys were stuck. And so I really felt that. I really felt that tragedy, and I think we did our best to communicate that.
I don't know of any illegal gambling. If there's any going on, well then of course I don't know where it is. My commissioner informs me, advises me that he doesn't know any.
Towards the end of 1986, about September 1986, I started working on a program about corruption in the Queensland Police Force. I had a friend who was with the Australian Bureau of Criminal Intelligence, and he said that a friend of his, a Queensland police officer, had a real dilemma because he'd been offered a bribe by a superior. Nothing too unusual about hearing stories about police officers being offered bribes, but from a superior suggested systemic corruption. There was a very high degree of difficulty in a program like this. First of all, where do you find your witnesses? You're not going to get any police to really come out and tell the truth about what was going on. And the other people who knew about the corruption, they were working in the brothel industry and the drugs trade or whatever. So the police, the crooked police, felt pretty comfortable that even if you could collect witnesses, they wouldn't really be believed. But there was this eureka moment where I got a choice document that demonstrated the link between the underworld and the police. The famous bagman, Jack Herbert, was a bit too greedy for his own good, and he went a little bit too far in getting a payment from some of the syndicate members in the form of a property. And we knew that Herbert was very close to the Police Commissioner Lewis. Australia was paying a big price, I think, in the 1980s for having neglected corruption reform in police forces right around the nation. And people can forget just how bad it was.
Into the squads and the sections of the police force that are probably the most important in the CI branch field anyway, you see the bagmen going in. They're the boss. They are in those squads for years and years. They gradually rise up and they take them over. And that's why you can't do anything about it.
The whole odour through the police force that was just so demoralising. They used to write on the walls, NRMA, you know, nothing really matters anymore. It was a cheerless enterprise because I didn't actually expect much from the program either. But a serious and thorough inquiry took place, and it didn't just look into policing, it looked at the integrity of government. The Queensland National Party, which just seemed to be all-powerful in the 1980s, ended up virtually withering and dying. When I go back and see Brisbane now, I just think that it's amazing. There's no Australian capital city that's changed as much in 20 years as Brisbane. And I think that program we did had a little bit to do with that. I think if you work in investigative journalism, you develop this good over-the-horizon radar where you get a sense that something that's small now is going to be big later. And Peter Manning had a great sense of this. He had great sort of instincts for journalism. And he was the one who said to me, why don't you go and have a look into this sinking of the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbour? It was an extraordinary punt, and I still shake my head when I think about it. I wonder whether decisions like that are ever made now, you know, because we're so risk averse. Because I didn't have any kind of plan B. But it didn't take long, and only 2 or 3 days of digging around before I started to think, the French Secret Service are involved here. This is a big story. And it was one of the rare occasions when a journalist from this corner of the world is going to do a story that was of interest to the whole world.
Blast on the Rainbow Warrior. There's a couple of people missing still in the water over here.
So that was fascinating too, the canvas, you know, these remote harbours of New Zealand and terrorism being practiced in a village. On 2 separate occasions, people noticed these so-called tourists and thought there was something odd about them to a point where they made a note of the number plate. And that's how they were caught. And then I found myself involved in a real-life spy thriller. When I arrived in Paris, the story was just beginning to break. It still hadn't been demonstrated that the DGSE, the French Secret Service, was involved, but there were serious suspicions. And as it happened, I knew more about the movements in New Zealand and beyond than anybody else because we'd been working on it for weeks at this point. So I had a lot of journalists in Paris knocking on my door. It was a real-time international investigation, and the timing was perfect because just as the French government delivered the whitewash saying that they weren't involved, we put this program to air that comprehensively demonstrated that they were involved. And I know the Belgians bought it and the Germans bought it. I'm not sure that the French did, but it was one of those occasions where I did something for the balance of payments that the program was sold in a lot of different countries.